Well, Jonathan, we had so much fun in the gallery talking about the quilts and the story of how everything came together. And what I just kind of wanted to do with wrap up today was talk about how you feel the show affected quilts history, quilt anything in the last 50 years. What do you feel like the impact of abstract design in American quilts was or is?
Well, there was certainly the immediate impact, the fact that it happened in a important New York modern art museum gave it an extraordinary leg up to begin with. And then when Hilton Kramer and other well-known art critics joined in with a lot of praise, that also helped, and it drew an enormous amount of attention. As I mentioned yesterday, the Whitney, for them, this was like a summer throwaway show. They didn't understand that it was going to be the most highly attended show up to that time they'd ever had. And I tried to I said, a lot of people are going to want catalogs. You could sell a lot of catalogs. So they printed $3,000 catalogs, and zip, they were gone. So it wasn't documented in that sense at the time. But as it began to travel around the world, first the French government contacted me and said that they wanted to do an exhibition it's a wing of the Louvre, Musée des Arts Décoratifs. And that was a dream come true, to be able to go to France
and the Louvre. Can't be better than that.
And do an exhibition, and it was very well arranged. Air France gave free transportation, and by that time we were old hands at making quilt exhibitions work, because right after the Whitney it went, I should have preceded France with the other exhibitions in the United States, which were all in major art museums, including the temporary gallery of the Smithsonian. Our show there was 1972. It was one of the first shows in that new facility. The other show was a show of religious sculpture, late medieval religious sculpture from a European country. And the curator, as Gail and I were setting up the quilt exhibition, putting things where we thought they'd be best, the curator of the Renwick Gallery is its name, went, "Oh my God, look at that." There were insects crawling out of the sculpture in a line across the museum floor. The ultimate nightmare for a curator.
Yes.
So we were witnessing all of this. It was so funny. So he frantically called the embassy of this country and got the cultural attaché, and he said, "What should we do? There are insects coming out of all the sculpture." And there was a long pause. The cultural attaché thinking, "Why am I talking to this idiot?" And there was a very long pause, and she said, "Kill them!" So, there never was a moment that Gail and I were involved with quilts that wasn't filled with happiness and joy. I mean, there were no downsides. So talk about a easy and wonderful thing to do. Then it went from, then the Smithsonian Institution asked if we'd put together a traveling show, which we did, using not necessarily the Whitney quilts, but exhibitions that had the same kind of sensibility, that looked like modern art, frankly, or that showed extraordinary instances of the amazing designs that quilt makers all on their own developed. That was the important thing, to show that this had happened a long time ago and over a very long period. We're talking several centuries. So we put together a traveling show, and that went to a lot of museums. And then at that point, that call from France came in, and we thought, we have died and gone to heaven. We're going to go to France for the show. And we did. They were incredible about getting it set up. It could not have been more efficiently handled. The show was a great success. The interesting thing was, we took that opportunity to start visiting other countries in Europe to see where the American inspiration for these quilts had come from, if in fact it was not a completely indigenous American thing. We didn't know. Well, of course, England. We knew that some quilt making traditions, both pieced and applique, had come from with English settlers, but had really been confined to the homes of the wealthy, not ordinary people. The explosion of design in American quilts happened when beautifully printed, colorful, independent cottons, because of the Industrial Revolution, costs came down so the average household, rather than just wealthy household, could afford it. And that was one of the triggers of the explosion in quilt making and quilt design. So after, and we printed a new catalog. The first really big catalog was printed for that Louvre show. Then that same catalog was done for an exhibition at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Lausanne, and the Palais Royal in Brussels, and then finally the Stedelijk in Amsterdam, which was my favorite because it is their museum dedicated to modern art. And they, at the same time, there was a show of our dear friend, one of my favorite American artists, Barnett Newman's paintings. He had passed away, and but his wife, Annalie, was there, and so she could travel with us a little. We took her with us, and we went to some of these places. And the interesting thing to us was we would go to the highest curator we could manage to get a date with in places like Holland and Belgium, etc., and said, you know, we'd really like to know, you are the people who would know, you are the curator of the great textile museum here. Was the tradition in Holland, for instance, of quilt making? And basically they all said, well, not much, we didn't really. But since that time, they have uncovered their own traditions. Mm-hmm. So that was a kind of secondary benefit. We didn't do any collecting because no one had quilts for sale. Had they been for sale, maybe we couldn't have afforded them, I have no idea. But in those countries, as it did here, it triggered a renewed interest in the quilting tradition. And I think if there's any legacy that came from the exhibition, maybe that's the most important one, that it triggered in all the countries, including the United States, it triggered interest in quilting, in the history, in the women who made it, etc., culminating in the extraordinary museum we are right now. And behind me is surrounded by Amish quilts
pieces
that still are, you know, I consider one of the great triumphs of American art. Not folk art, not women's art, not quilt makers' art, American art. One of the great triumphs. They're extraordinary. They're breathtaking still when I look at them.
They're stunning, absolutely stunning.
And there has been various speculation as to where they came from. The other day, for the first time, I was researching some textiles. I saw a picture of a paisley shawl, late 18th, early 19th century paisley shawl, which is exactly the format of an Amish quilt. Mm-hmm. A frame-centered diamond, corner blocks, and I thought maybe a rich woman in Philadelphia wore one of these into Amish quilting. But then there have been a lot of speculation about the very similar Welsh quilts. So we don't really know. I know where certain things came from, but we don't really know what the inspiration for the Amish. We can say, well, they're all solid colors because they don't wear printed materials. Okay, fine. And they were near Philadelphia, where there were a lot of wealthy families in Philadelphia, beginning in the late 17th, like going into the 18th century certainly, and a lot of imported fabrics. So these fantastic wools were coming into Philadelphia, and we've been told that peddlers' wagons were carrying these kind of things materials, pots and pans, etc., into Amish country because the Amish were traveling to the stores. So again, that may be the truth, but we don't really know at this point. I hope that research will continue.
We always have to build on, step by step, build that research. And I think that is another area, and I think you'll talk about that with Jonathan Gregory and his exhibition, Raising the Profile, that, like you said, that interest in quilt and quilt history was promoted by abstract design, but it was also the makers, the collectors, and the academics. Everything kind of just followed step by step after the 70s, and the 1971 show is kind of the cornerstone of it all.
Yeah, and when you think about what happened here, it began as the International Quilt Study Center, which it was part of the Home Economics Department, and I thought, my God, I didn't know they still had Home Economics Department. It was
No.
I had that in high school. In any case, and with its first director, Pat Cruz, who did a fabulous job, who was a textile chemical
Textile scientist.
scientist.
Yes.
She was a textile scientist.
And a historian. I mean,
And
by
a
the time
historian.
her groundbreaking work in the Nebraska Quilt Project was what caught the James's eye. So she had become very well versed in quilt history by that time, but it was not her area. She was a textile scientist, but I think with that scientific brain, she knew how to set up the parameters for our collection and really strict guidelines for how we care for the collection. And when we became accredited by the American Alliance for Museums, it was a different name at that time, but they actually use our application as an example for other museums because
Wow, I didn't
we
know
had
that.
established such great guidelines and such great policies and procedures that it gave us a really great head start to have a leader like Pat who understood the importance of that, what exhibition would do to a textile, the degradation of it, things like that. She just really set us up beautifully. And we are not a part of the Home Ec Department anymore, and they've since changed their name 2 or 3 times. But that's an interesting point because we still are kind of fighting that battle. Like you said, you're not going to call something folk art or women's art, it's just art. And that is still, I think, something that, if there's one thing that hasn't changed, it's still this perception, even within the broader area and much more interest in it, people outside of our little quilt world, our big quilt world, still feel like this is something that was done in the home and it's not art, or is it art? And that question just comes up over and over again. And how do you react to that idea and that constant discussion we seem to have?
Well, they've gone, in an attempt to apply normal scholarly categories to things, everybody tries to define things and put things in boxes. So you have high art, called high art, painting and sculpture made by artists who have given their lives to making art. That's all they do. Now they may have 3 other jobs to survive, like working in a pet store and waiting tables.
Yes.
But they have dedicated their lives to being an artist. Then there's so-called folk art. And then to differentiate certain kinds within that category or next to it, there's outsider art. Well, for me, these categorizations are maybe necessary academically, but don't mean very much as far as I'm concerned. I mean, so-called outsiders art, many of them, yes, just like the New York kids trying to be artists have waiters' jobs. They had jobs as mechanics and all kinds of things, but they were doing the same thing. They were making art on the side from anything they could get, shingles and paint they'd been given. Why do we call them outsider artists? Because they didn't train classically. But for me, those distinctions are arbitrary and they bother me a good bit, especially as applied to quilts, because no one in the United States made anything that looked like Amish quilts. They developed it themselves, they made it themselves for many decades, and so what do we call, oh, they're just quilts. No, I'm sorry, I can't accept that. And we've worked really hard to change those perceptions. We all have. And I think to some extent it's been successful. We've got to accept the fact that the art world is about making money, ultimately, for gallery owners, etc. And there's, a huge mystique about collectors and what goes to museums and what isn't in museums. It's at once an intellectual discipline, but it's also at the same time a commercial enterprise. And we have to, I accept that about it. It's the fact that people want to have art in their homes is what keeps artists painting. And that there are museums that want art, that keeps artists sculpting. And quilt makers working now. The thing that's slowly beginning to happen is the development. The Whitney show is given some credit for helping to institute the whole idea of art quilts. There were certainly women who got it early on and considered themselves artists, and not just, yes, they said we're quilt makers, but we are artists. And in fact, in our first show in Japan in 1975, we showed the work of two young American women whose work we thought was fabulous. And we had pictures of it in the gallery. We said, this is what is coming. This is what's going to come. And it's come big time all over the world. And I often tell the story. I love it so much that we did the first show at the Ginza Gallery of Shiseido, and we had the normal in Japanese, please don't touch, and Japanese women were I'm sorry, they weren't going to listen to that. They had to see what the back looked like. And finally I just said, take the signs down, I don't care. And in part it's because of Japan is one of the few sophisticated countries in the world that class textiles along with other what we say is the so-called fine arts, like painting scrolls, painting screens, and all of the wonderful sculpture that they have done over many centuries. Textiles are right up there. So the veneration for textiles that was embedded in Japanese society from an ancient time helped to cause this incredible explosion of interest.
Especially in Japan.
Yeah, especially in Japan, yeah.
Yeah, and they really caught on very early on and were very fascinated with American quilts particularly. I think it's really interesting too that now we are seeing them kind of break away from those traditions. I mean, they have won awards at the Houston festivals. They have shown that they are masters of construction, the detail they work. But what we're seeing now is the develop of their independent art in the textile medium, which I think is a really exciting development. But that is something that's come relatively new. I think that's in most countries outside of the U.S. It was a later development than it was in the U.S. because it really did. And in our show, New York Nexus, we see that these artists who were in the 70s who were looking at women's work and looking at textile art and saying, how can I incorporate that and that development of the art or studio quilt? And it has just, I think that's one of the strengths of our collection is that James has recognized that work, and artist James had the most amazing eye, worked with Penny McMorris to really get some of the leaders who began in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, but really flourished in the 70s and 80s, and then it's just taken off. It's such a huge part of the quilt world now.
Yeah, when I first heard about the James, and there was this interesting eccentric couple near New York City who built a gallery in the second floor of their garage and had a great quilt. Well, naturally I had to meet them, so I called and they were very gracious, and I went and we were instant friends. I adored artists. She was fantastic. Bob was very smart and fully supported her, was right along with her once he got it. And from then on, we were very much in touch, and we talked a lot about what should happen to their collection and where they wanted to see quilts go in general. And Bob, you got to remember, he was a Nebraska farm boy. He talked about getting up at 5 in the morning to get the horses hitched up for plowing. I went, oh my God. So But then, of course, he had a huge international career and then had his own career as a developer, and so they had the means to do what they wished. And we talked a lot about New York, where, of course, I lived at the time. And I said, it isn't just about quilts. It's about any big collection that goes to a big New York museum. You'll have a catalog and a cocktail party, and then it will go to storage in Brooklyn, and every once in a while one of them will come out. And it is not a derogatory thing, it's just that the encyclopedic museums have an obligation to show everything, and so they can't show everything at once.
Yeah.
So that really got Bob and Artis thinking about where they really wanted to see quilts established, where they could help see quilts established as a national and international accepted art phenomenon. And here we are, we're in Nebraska.
Here we are.
Here we are, Lincoln.
Almost 25 years later. Isn't that just amazing?
Yeah, just amazing. And the James family and the James Foundation has continued to give just wonderful support to this museum, and for that, everyone is eternally grateful, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for my job so much. Yeah, I think it's just a great example, and the Jameses probably did it in a bigger way, in a broader way than many people did, but boy, we are seeing just so many collectors that have hundreds of quilts in their homes that love them so much and built these collections. And again, that was another outgrowth of that, all that interest in quilting, and the Jameses are just a great example of it. And fortunately for us, they had the means to really establish a collection and the knowledge to understand that it needed to include everything. Bob used to always say that, you'd sit down at lunch with his list of things to do, and he's like, we need everything. Like, yeah, and it's an overwhelming task, but they started us out with such an amazing collection that, and the continued support, especially in our building, has really just made everything come true.
That is crucial. That's crucial, the building, because people don't understand the care that's required to conserve and store textiles. Poor Carolyn and her co-curators are deluged daily with offers of quilts, and they've had to learn how to say nicely, I'm sorry, but we can't, people don't understand what it takes to maintain this kind of collection. They just don't get it. So Carolyn could now go directly from here to a diplomatic job.
I have learned how to say no in a nice way, haven't I? Oh my gosh. It's a lesson you have to learn. And there is just something, because quilts were in homes and because people were so passionate about making them, even when we met with Robert Cargill and got the African American collection, and these women were economically challenged, they would say, yeah, we needed quilts for the family, so I made a quilt for everybody to keep them warm in the winter, and then I didn't stop. And then you'd see in the corner of their house, there'd be a pile of 100 quilts that they just loved the creation of them so much. And I think that crosses the board to any culture and any quilter. So they make so many. The thing I think is really fascinating, but that hurts their opportunity to come into be part of a museum collection, is that women were following the fashions. They always followed the trends. And so in the Midwest, we see certain styles that were made over and over again. And of course, that's what we get offered, is the same style over and over again, and that affects what we then collect. But it's so sophisticated in a way, and in so many ways, just like you said, it's no different than any other art form. Whether they had formal training or not, they had training of some sort, whether it was from their family or their neighbor, or just seeing quilts at the fair that they wanted to try and create themselves. There's that continuity. And the other thing I think has been so great as a museum for us to develop is the international collection, because when I started back in '97 at the museum, we were aware of some Indian quilts. Patricia Stoddard had stopped in one day and gave us 4 pieces from her collection, but we had no idea what we were going to encounter. But Bob James was like, they're out there and you need to find them. And he would tell us the story of driving in a cab with somebody, and he would say, well, what did you sleep under when you were a kid? And get that conversation started. And that has become one of, I think, the most exciting elements of our collection, because that if it's not exactly quilting, the patchwork tradition has come from all over. And now we have amazing collections from 65 different countries. So it was much more worldwide than I think we realized early on. And that's the joy of the time going by, is what we've learned and what we keep adding to that lexicon of knowledge.
It occurred to me years after that what went on in terms of quilt making was what had gone on, that Gail and I had seen among, most of our friends were artists in New York, and so we were very much part of that art world. I was taking photographs on a professional basis for galleries and catalogs, etc. So most of our life revolved within that world. And the same things that kept young artists going, you know, getting together, looking at each other's work, studio visits, catalogs, were the same thing that happened in quilting.
Yeah.
Women got together, they traded patterns, they talked about it, they quilted together. Ladies' magazines and periodicals had articles on quilting and showed patterns, and even patterns you could cut out and use to create blocks. So from a standpoint of a kind of intellectual development, it was very similar. Again, for me, it kept it keeps narrowing is what what I mean.
Yeah, it does.
And as for African American quilts, the interesting thing to me is the one person. If there's one person considered the most, if most important African American quilt maker, the Rembrandt, is Anna Williams, and she was a complete artist. She wasn't making quilts because she never cared about making them into quilts. She just made these glorious tops. She worked as a domestic for a woman who was a quilter, was a member of a quilt guild, and had a quilt shop. So Anna was just being given the scraps from quilt making, and she created these unbelievable paintings, really is what they are, fabric paintings, that she never cared whether they became quilts with backs and backing. That wasn't what she was doing. She was just making art. So that, to me, is an example, has always been a great example for me to remember when I think about this subject. You know, what are we dealing with here? So I think that has become more and more of an accepted tradition because of the rise of so-called art quilts or studio quilts, and I'm trying to get everyone to knock off quilts, just art. Just art, let's just call it art. Because I did an exhibition as long ago as 2013 for the annual European Patchwork, which is in France. And I took an exhibition from our family collection and borrowing from here, the quilts that they feel they can lend. And it was my first chance in a long time to see entries from all over the world. And it ranged from some American quilt makers making meticulous copies of 1830s and 40s applique quilts to things that had nothing at all to do with ancient quilting traditions. Hanging strips of fabric, wire constructions with a little bit of fabric on them. These are not quilts. These are something else. So the issue for this museum was Bob James saying everything, and so now everything has gone from here to here. And this museum has to make really hard choices with their acquisitions funds, the curator's time, exhibition space, etc.
Absolutely, gosh, yes. And actually, that's one of the most fun things, is to see that development over time. When we were very new and we would ask people for quilts or talk about exhibitions, and we were still kind of an unknown, and people were a little wary and they weren't sure, and were we going to last? And now that has kind of come full circle, and now they're coming to us saying, well, I want my quilts in the museum, I want to give you quilts. And so that has been a blessing and a demanding part of the job, but wow, what a fabulous journey.
Yeah, so the enigma now for this museum, which has become, in effect, you know, you think of encyclopedic museums, all right, the Metropolitan, the British Museum, that have great art from all the cultures in the world, and they don't, you know, including folk art, etc. But this has become the encyclopedic museum in the world for quilts and things, and a lot of things that have employed quilt techniques, piecing, applique, especially in cultures that did not make padded quilts for beds. In some cases, they were way too hot, but they made them because they were making decorative art. Oops, I just did it. Decorative art.
It's hard not to, because these terms are what we have,
Right.
and it's hard not to use those terms, but it's something that we're always aware of, and we try to kind of overcome it, but yet you have to have a way of describing what we're talking about. And so,
Well, I think we should note that especially when the first reviews came out, there was blowback from some feminist scholars about exactly what we were doing. Why were we manipulating the subject matter, including one very well-known review now that said this was another instance of men taking women's accomplishments into the art world, which is basically run by men. I mean, that's a crude way of saying it. But there are those kinds of and all of those issues are legitimate. There's nothing that we shouldn't talk about, because the more we talk, the more we know. And so you started this by saying what has been what was the effect in the world of that exhibition, and I think we've hit most of the high points, but introducing other people to their quilting traditions was very important, and those auxiliary exhibitions in Europe, plus the follow-up catalogs, did that. I'll never forget going to the Rijksmuseum, and there's a wonderful, the head of the textile department, the curator of the textile department. We got a date. Someone kindly enough got a date, and I said I'm here to talk to you about this country's quilting tradition, and she said we have none, and it was absolutely untrue, and that was not her fault. Let me give you another example. We've spent a lot of time in Italy. My family has over the years, and one summer I spent part of the summer with a friend of mine who ours is on the Tuscan side of Italy, and her family house is on the Adriatic side, not the Atlantic side, Mediterranean side. So I said, she speaks perfect Italian, which I didn't, and I said, was there a quilting tradition here? Because in Casanova, New York, one day, a woman carrying a quilt walked into my office, and from sitting where I could see her, I said, that's not an American quilt. And she said, no, my grandmother brought this to Italy when she came in 1920 to join her husband. This was a bridal quilt. And I said, oh my goodness. So it was a whole cloth. The thing that amazed me, it was a whole cloth quilt, early 20th century, that in color and quilting looked very much like some very early Italian quilts, Sicilian quilts, in the museum's collection, 17th century, early 18th century. I went, oh my goodness, that is extraordinary. And she very kindly has given us to the museum. So while I was in Italy on that side where her family had come from, the Adriatic side, I said to my friend, could you ask your neighbors if they had quilt? Well, all of a sudden quilts began to appear from attics. They got central heating too, guys, just like us. And the comments ranged from, oh, my children would, I just put these in the attic because my children were going to throw them out. So, and then the more I asked, and I documented, in every house I documented everything as carefully as I could with photographs and notes, people started giving me quilts for the museum. So, and then we went to the house of the great patron of the village, the wealthiest family, and they had their quilts from going back 5 or 6 generations, and there I saw silk quilts, same color, same kind of stitching, and 200 years or more later after the ones I had seen at the museum in Nebraska. So with these 10 or so quilts that we were given, I shipped them all back to the museum. But here is a country that had an extraordinary ancient quilting tradition, maybe the oldest in Europe, I believe it was. And here's a whole part of Italy where that tradition is now gone. It now resides in a museum in the American heartland. So and do I want to go back and do more research? You bet. I hope I get to do it. But the point is that all over the world, triggering interest in quilts has been quite extraordinary. So, and what it's done in terms of quilt making, I don't want to claim that we started art quilts. We didn't. There were people making extraordinary so-called art or studio quilts from before our exhibition, but it certainly gave it impetus.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
I agree. I think that's something that in the catalog that we did for the show that I addressed was that so many people saw quilts at that time, but it was in the 70s when there were also a lot of interest in other female artists. There were so many other factors going on but it really promoted the idea that quilts could be something that was made for the wall, not for the bed, and it's taken off since then. So I think the 70s was an amazing decade, and I think that this was a part of it that was very important to all things, whether it was the women themselves, the makers, collecting, exhibiting, studying. I think that's when everything came back, and we recognize that as kind of the quilt revival, but we're a great example right here.
Well, the other interesting thing that I just thought of is that those 70s in New York were one of its greatest eras. It became the center of the art world, and also at that time, female artists began slowly to get the recognition they had always deserved. And I see them. I photographed a lot of them in their studios for the exhibitions that they were finally beginning to get, that they deserved, and they were finally beginning to get. So these changes in perception of both art and who made it very much helped the revival of interest in quilts. It wasn't just folk art people, it was a lot of people. And then when we finally began to collect Amish quilts after the first one we found, we concentrated as much as we could because we knew it was a very finite resource, and it did catch on in New York, and people who collected modern art immediately saw the links between Amish work and the work of Barnett Newman and Albers, etc. And so there were then very high-powered New York folk art dealers selling Amish quilts, and then people who never had dealt in art at all, like Phyllis Hayters, selling Amish quilts. And that was an easy sell because they look great. You could put any one of these in this room next to an Albers and everybody would go, oh my goodness, that's terrific. So there were a lot of, it wasn't just our show, it was our show plus cultural changes that were happening that fortunately all came together at the same time and to produce a new kind of energy. And I think that if I look at it as objectively as I possibly can, which is sometimes difficult, that's the article that remains to be written, is to bring all of those pieces together. Maybe I'll live long enough to do that, I don't know.
We touched on it in the catalog. We kind of
No, wait, tell them what the catalog is.
Oh, the catalog, Abstract Design in American Quilts at 50, was something that we're so proud of that we produced to show the original 60 quilts again, plus these other shows that show the kind of the long-term impact. And so I think it's just been amazing to go back and look and to think 50 years has gone by.
Wait a minute.
Well, I've been at the museum almost 25 years now. How did that happen? I'm not nearly old enough to. Anyway.
But when they decided here to do the 50th anniversary, there was one at the 20th in Louisville, for which there was a catalog printed. But this new catalog is great because it enabled me to bring all of my thinking forward, and and everyone, the incredible curators here, gave them a chance to look now, and what's happening now is where we were then. So the exhibition is wonderful for me. Talk about nostalgia. I just wish Gail were here to enjoy it. But at least our children will, so they'll be coming soon to see it. But I cannot believe it. I've been here now 2 days, and it's just overwhelming and gorgeous. So get to see it.
Get to see it.